Two girls hiring a stranger on the street to be their father for a day. Sounds like the most absurd plan in the world, right? But what happened at that simple school party, amidst children's performances and curious glances, unearthed a secret that had been kept for almost a decade. A chance encounter, a forgotten night, and a truth hidden in plain sight forever changed the fate of a businessman who thought he had it all, of two girls who just wanted a complete family, and of a mother who struggled to hide her past behind her tired smile. But before we find out how an innocent request on a Chicago street corner unlocked a secret from the past and brought four lives together forever, we want to know, what city are you joining us from, and what time is it there? Leave your comment, like the video, and get ready for this exciting story. Friday morning arrived in Chicago with a pale, determined light that filtered through the windows of a modest apartment in Lincoln Park, promising one of those crisp autumn days. For Sarah Miller, however, the light served only to illuminate the exhaustion that seemed to have become embedded in the very mortar of the building. The distant rhythmic sound of the L-line train was the soundtrack to her life, a steady pulse that measured her days of juggling two jobs, the mounting bills, and the monumental effort of being the sole support for her two daughters, Mia and Chloe. She moved around the compact kitchen with robotic efficiency, the smell of coffee the only indulgence in a budget that was stretched to the limit. Her love for her daughters was her driving force, a powerful engine that propelled her through her fatigue and anxiety. But she felt her fuel running low with each day, with each forced smile that hid the weight of rowing alone against the tide of a big, unforgiving city. On Mia and Chloe's identical faces, the energy of that morning was a force of nature, an electricity that seemed to make the small apartment vibrate. They wore matching navy blue velvet dresses, bought on sale and saved religiously for the most anticipated event of the school year, Family Day. Their class performance, which they had talked about incessantly for weeks, was the highlight of their young 7-year-old lives. They chatted about the songs, the art projects that would be hanging on the walls, and which classmate had the loudest family. Sarah watched them, her heart clenched with a fierce pride that was almost painful. She poured them cereal and milk, trying to soak up their joy, knowing with a mother's premonition that their happiness was fragile, susceptible to being punctured by the harsh reality she was trying to keep at bay. The first crack in that happiness appeared when Chloe, the quieter and more observant of the two, paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Mom," she said, her voice suddenly devoid of excitement, "Emily's dad will be there. He promised to bring his new camera to film everything." The word "dad" hung in the kitchen air, heavy and unfamiliar. Mia, the more impulsive, dropped her spoon into the bowl with a thud, her expression mirroring her sister's. The vibrant energy that had once filled the room began to dissipate, sucked into a vacuum they were familiar with, but most days they managed to ignore. Today, on Family Day, that absence was not just a feeling, but a visible empty seat in the front row of the school auditorium. Sarah felt the familiar pang in her chest, a mix of guilt, sadness, and helpless rage at the unfairness of it all. "Our family is perfect in its own way, my loves," Sarah said, her voice a little louder than she intended, trying to fill the silence with optimism. "We're the best team, aren't we? The Miller Dream Team." She spread her hands across the small table, an invitation for their bonding ritual. The girls placed their small hands over hers, but the grip was weak, the gesture mechanical. The truth was, as much as they loved their team, the world beyond the walls of their apartment operated by different rules. They saw it at picnics in the park, at baseball games, at birthday parties. A father figure, a man who would teach them how to throw a ball, who would put them on his shoulders to watch the parades, who would be here today, standing next to their mother, smiling proudly. Their dream team seemed, in those moments, to be missing a key player. It was Mia who broke the deadlock. She exchanged a look with Chloe, one of those silent, complex conversations that only twins can have. In an instant, A bold idea, born of frustration and necessity, was proposed and accepted. Chloe, who was usually the voice of caution, saw the glimmer of desperation in her mother's eyes, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and her hesitation turned to silent determination. A barely perceptible nod was all the confirmation Mia needed. They didn't want to be the cause of that shadow on their mother's face anymore. They didn't want to feel that emptiness anymore. If the world insisted that a family day needed a father to be complete, then they were going to get one. The decision was made, a pact sealed in the stillness of a Chicago fall morning. While Sarah cleaned up the kitchen, her mind already miles away, mentally calculating how many extra hours she would have to work at her second job as a waitress to make up for the afternoon off, the two girls went to their room. Their mission, conceived by Mia's fearless imagination and organized by Chloe's practical mind, was as simple as it was risky. They needed a surrogate dad, just for a few hours. The criteria were clear. He had to be friendly, tall, to look convincing, and have a smile that wasn't creepy. They emptied their piggy bank, gathering a handful of quarters and a few crumpled dollar bills, their investment capital for the most important operation of their lives. It was their payment, a binding contract in their childish logic. The escape was executed with stealthy precision. Using the sound of the shower to muffle any noise, the sisters put on their shoes, coats, and opened the front door with infinite care, holding their breath at every creak of the old wooden floor. They tiptoed down the stairs, hand in hand, the adrenaline of adventure mixing with the seriousness of their purpose. The street greeted them with the cold, biting air coming off Lake Michigan and the noise of the city waking up. Cars, buses, and the distant sound of a siren created an urban symphony that, for two 7-year-old girls alone, was both exciting and deeply intimidating. But that day, they were not just two girls. They were recruiters on a secret mission. They found a strategic vantage point on a busy street corner near a coffee shop that smelled deliciously of coffee and pastries. From there, they could gauge the steady stream of men on their way to work. Their selection process was methodical. "That one looks too angry," Mia whispered, pointing to a man who was gesturing wildly as he spoke on his cell phone. "And that one looks too rushed," Chloe added, seeing another man hurrying to cross the street. They needed someone who fit their mental image of a dad, a collage of movie characters and their friends' fathers, someone who wouldn't look out of place next to their mother. The task, however, was proving to be harder than they had anticipated, and a tinge of discouragement began to creep into their determination. Several blocks away, in the pulsing heart of Chicago's Loop, Ethan Hayes walked with the kind of easy confidence of someone who is used to having the world bend to his will. At 34, he was a titan in the venture capital world, his firm occupying 3 floors of one of the glass and steel skyscrapers that scraped the city's skyline. His suit was tailored, his watch a masterpiece of Swiss engineering, and his mind was completely focused on the presentation of a 9-figure deal he would close in less than an hour. He was a man who lived by schedules, data, and results, and the world around him was little more than a blurry backdrop to his inner calculations. He barely noticed the iconic architecture that surrounded him or the crowds that parted as he passed, immersed as he was in his own stratosphere of ambition. Ethan paused for a moment, not far from the corner where the girls kept their vigil, to take a call. His voice was calm and controlled, speaking the fluid language of international business, but beneath his professional calm, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a kind of emptiness. He was successful, wealthy, and powerful, but his days were a series of meetings, flights, and anonymous hotel rooms. His life was a fortress of success, but it was a fortress of solitude. He ended the call, and for a brief moment looked out over the Chicago River, its dark waters contrasting with the steel of the buildings. The moment of introspection was fleeting, quickly replaced by the pressure of his next meeting. He resumed his journey, his ruthless businessman mask firmly in place. It was at that precise moment that the girls saw him. His height, his impeccable suit, his aura of importance. At first glance, he was the exact opposite of what they were looking for. He seemed to belong to another universe, a world of limousines and expensive dinners, not school parties and children's drawings. Their dismay deepened. Their mission seemed doomed. But then something unexpected happened. A gust of wind from the lake snatched a handful of papers from the hands of a passing young student, scattering them across the sidewalk. As others passed by indifferently, Ethan, without hesitation, bent down to help her. He moved with surprising speed and grace, catching the fluttering pages, his expensive suit forgotten for a moment. He handed the girl the papers with a genuine smile and a kind word that was lost in the noise of the city. It was a small gesture, a mundane act of kindness. But to the two little watchers across the street, it was a sign, a beacon of hope. This important man wasn't too important to help. This serious man had a smile that reached his eyes. The hope that had nearly been extinguished flared up again with the force of a fire. He wasn't just an expensive suit. There was a person inside, a nice person, and suddenly he wasn't just an option. He was the only option. "It's him," Mia said, her voice filled with unshakable conviction. Chloe nodded, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Paragraph 13. Summoning every ounce of courage their little souls could muster, they waited for the pedestrian light to turn green. Holding hands, with a strength that made their knuckles turn white, they crossed the street, two tiny specks of blue velvet moving with giant determination through a jungle of hurried legs. Ethan was about to enter his office building, his mind already back on charts and projections, when he felt a gentle but insistent tug on his coat sleeve. His first reaction was irritation, expecting a beggar or a salesman. He turned away, a refusal already forming on his lips, but the words died before they could be born. What he saw stopped his world. Before him stood two identical girls, their serious, expectant faces looking up at him with an intensity that was both disconcerting and captivating. Their large brown eyes seemed to hold both hope and the weight of the world. For a moment, no one said anything. They just assessed him, as if checking whether his earlier kindness was genuine or a fluke. And Ethan, a man who could intimidate entire boards of directors with a look, felt completely disarmed. His rush, his important meeting, all evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming curiosity. Who were these two small, solemn creatures who had dared to pierce his impenetrable bubble? Mia, assuming her role as leader, stepped forward, holding out her small canvas bag, which held the money as if it were a diplomatic offering. She took a deep breath, the sound audible in the brief silence that had formed around them in the chaos of the city, and prepared to deliver her speech. Her voice, when it finally came, was a little shaky, but it was filled with a sincerity that was impossible to fake. She looked Ethan straight in the eyes, those eyes that up close seemed more tired than stern, and asked the question that would change the course of his life in a way he could never have predicted in his most elaborate risk-taking scenarios. His life, up to this point, had been a straight line of success. It was about to take a 90-degree turn. "Excuse me, sir," Mia said, her voice firming. "We have a business proposition for you." Beside him, Chloe nodded vigorously, her round eyes never leaving Ethan's face. The word business was a language Ethan understood. His surprise gave way to puzzled amusement. He looked from one to the other, trying to process the data. Twins, matching dresses, a business proposition. It didn't fit any of his models. His instincts, usually reserved for corporate takeovers, told him there was something more here. He found himself crouching down, a move he hadn't made in years, to get down on their level, to enter their world. If only for a moment. "A business proposition?" he repeated, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm all ears, but I warn you, my fees are quite high." He tried to keep his tone light, but their seriousness didn't waver. This wasn't a joke. These were two clients with an urgent need. "We can afford it," Chloe said, her voice a firm whisper gesturing toward the bag Mia was holding. "We need a father, but just for today, for family day at our school." The proposition was thrown out into the air, simple, direct, and so extraordinary that it left him speechless. The reality of the situation hit him with the force of a punch. This wasn't a joke, it was a plea for help disguised as a business transaction. As Ethan tried to process the most bizarre request of his life, Sarah Miller's reality turned into a nightmare. When she stepped out of the shower, the silence in the apartment was her first alarm. Normally, the girls would be laughing or arguing over which hair ribbon to wear. "Mia? Chloe?" she called, a twinge of anxiety tightening her throat. She paced the small apartment, her heart starting to beat faster. Their bedroom was empty. The living room was empty. And then she saw it, the front door slightly ajar. Her blood ran cold in her veins. They were out, alone. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over her. The school presentation, her own exhaustion, all disappeared, replaced by the primal terror of a mother whose children have disappeared in the middle of a city of millions. Back on the sidewalk, Ethan stared at the girls' faces, his mind racing with the situation. His first concern was their safety. Two children alone in downtown Chicago, approaching strangers. Where was their mother? His logical, problem-solving mind began to search for a panicked adult nearby, but there was no one. It was just them, standing in front of him, placing terrifying, absolute faith in him, a complete stranger. The audacity of their plan was breathtaking. It was the most reckless and yet courageous thing he had ever witnessed. He felt a surge of protectiveness for them, an unsolicited responsibility that had been thrust upon him along with this impossible request. His schedule, his multi-million-dollar meeting, his perfectly structured life, all of it demanded that he say no. A polite but firm no. That he would take them to a security guard or a police officer and go about his day. It was the logical choice, the responsible choice, and yet he couldn't bring himself to do it. He saw in their eyes a reflection of a loneliness he himself knew well, the loneliness that lurked beneath his success. Saying no to them felt, in some way, like saying no to a forgotten part of himself. The decision that should have been made instantly became the most complex negotiation of his life, a negotiation not of numbers, but of humanity, fought out in the middle of a busy sidewalk under the expectant gaze of two 7-year-old girls. Ethan Hayes' world, a universe built on certainty, data, and investment returns, shook to its foundations. He looked at the two small faces before him, identical in their features, but unique in their expressions of nervous hope, and felt the edifice of his logical life tilting dangerously. His mind, an instrument finely tuned to analyze risk and maximize profits, screamed at him every reason to refuse. It was reckless, a colossal distraction, a potential nightmare of responsibility. His assistant, the efficient and relentless Mrs. Jennings, would have already prepared the conference room, and his failure to show up for a meeting of this magnitude would send shockwaves through his company. But logic seemed a dead language compared to the raw, fundamental need emanating from these two children. This was not a request for a toy or a candy bar. It was a request for presence, for a void to be filled, something so essential that it transcended any contract or financial projection. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, the sleek, cool device that was his scepter, his link to the empire he had built. His thumb hovered over Mrs. Jennings's contact. One tap, and he would make up an excuse, a manufactured emergency, a postponement that would tarnish his reputation for absolute reliability. For a second, hesitation won out. The weight of his responsibilities, of the jobs that depended on his decisions, pulled him back to reality. But then his gaze fell on the small canvas bag Mia held, spread out like a state treasure. That small bag contained the entirety of his fee, a few crumpled dollars, and an infinite amount of faith. And in that moment, Ethan realized that the risk of losing a deal was infinitely smaller than the risk of crushing that faith. He took a deep breath of the cold Chicago air and made the most illogical and human decision of his life, typing a short message. "Unavoidable family emergency. Cancel the meeting. I apologize for the inconvenience." As he put away his phone, he felt a strange lightness, as if he had just released a great weight as he threw himself off a cliff. It was a liberating terror. He looked back at the girls, who had been following his every move with breathtaking intensity. He gave them a smile, this time not the polite, quick smile he gave to business partners, but a genuine, if slightly uncertain, smile. "Okay," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'll take the job." The word, so simple, had the effect of an explosion of confetti. Mia and Chloe's solemn faces transformed, breaking into smiles so radiant they seemed to compete with the pale morning sun. Mia let out a small cry of joy, and Chloe jumped in place, clapping her gloved hands together. In that instant, Ethan Hayes, the master of the Chicago financial universe, felt like the richest man in the world, paid not in stocks, but in pure, distilled, childlike joy. The change in atmosphere was immediate and overwhelming. The two statues of seriousness gave way to two sources of bubbling energy. They surrounded him, asking questions and giving instructions with the authority of seasoned casting directors. "My name is Mia, and this is Chloe," Mia introduced. "To cross the street, you have to hold our hands, one each," Chloe instructed with a knowing air. "And when we sing our school song, you have to clap loudly, louder than all the other parents." Ethan, still squatting on the sidewalk, felt like a fledgling actor who had just been given the lead in a play he hadn't auditioned for. He laughed, a genuine, easygoing sound he rarely heard himself make. "My name is Ethan," he said. "It's a pleasure to work for you, my new bosses." In the midst of his newfound joy, his analytical brain finally rebooted, focusing on the logistics of the situation. His first responsibility as temporary father was to make sure their mother was aware of the arrangement. "Girls, where's your mother?" he asked, his tone becoming more serious. "She needs to know where you are." "She's at home, getting ready," Mia said with disarming ease. Ethan felt a chill. His brave adventure was really an escape. Their mother must be out of her mind. "We have to get home right now," he said firmly. "The first rule of being a father is to make sure your mother doesn't panic." He stood and held out his hands. Without a hint of hesitation, they placed their small hands in his. The sensation was new and strange and incredibly real, their warmth and trust flowing into him, making his surreal role a little more solid. The walk back to their apartment in Lincoln Park, which he estimated would be a 20-minute walk, was a journey into another dimension. Ethan, accustomed to navigating airport terminals and hotel lobbies with impersonal efficiency, now walked slowly along the sidewalk, his long, purposeful stride matching the girls' short legs. They kept up a steady conversation, pointing out the double-decker buses, the dogs on walks, and the fall decorations in the windows of the brick houses. They told him about their teacher, Mrs. Davison, and about the science project in which they had built a volcano out of Play-Doh. He listened, asked questions, feeling more present and focused in this conversation than he had during any conference call in weeks. The strangeness of the situation diminished with each step, replaced by a sense of strange and unexpectedly pleasant normalcy. As Ethan navigated this strange new reality, Sarah Miller's reality was a spiraling nightmare. She ran down the stairs of her apartment building, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The street, normally a familiar scene of neighbors and local shops, had become a hostile place, full of unseen dangers. Every passing car was a threat. Every unfamiliar face a potential predator. She ran down the sidewalk, her eyes scanning the crowd in a frantic search, her daughter's names dying on her lips, her throat too tight with panic to scream. The navy velvet of their dresses was her only hope. A splash of color she searched for with the intensity of a beacon in the darkness. Guilt was a poison spreading through her veins. Her exhaustion, her inability to give them what they wanted, it had all led to this. A little over a street away, Ethan and the girls turned the corner. Chloe was in the middle of a detailed description of how proud her surrogate father should look during the performance. "You have to smile the whole time, even if our music is a little off-key." Ethan smiled, imagining himself doing just that. He, whose face in public was a mask of calculated neutrality. This was a world of open, unfiltered emotion, an ecosystem entirely different from his own. He felt like an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar tribe, but instead of observing from a distance, he had been appointed their temporary leader. The girls' trust in him was total. They walked beside him, chattering, completely oblivious to the storm of panic his absence was causing. And then Sarah saw them. At first, it was just a glimpse of navy blue in the distance. Her heart leapt with relief so violent it made her dizzy. They were there. They were safe. But the relief lasted only a heartbeat, because the next thing she knew, she saw the tall figure standing between them. A man. An impeccably dressed stranger, holding her daughter's hands as if he owned the world. The relief turned to ice, and the ice to volcanic fury. A mother's fear of losing her children is surpassed only by a mother's rage at seeing them threatened. In that moment, Ethan Hayes was not a businessman performing a bizarre act of kindness. He was the embodiment of all her worst fears. She didn't think, she just ran, driven by a primal force. Ethan saw the woman running toward them before the girls saw her, and his stomach sank. The expression on her face, a mask of panic and fury, left no room for doubt. It was their mother, and she didn't see a good Samaritan. She saw a nightmare walking. He stopped instinctively, bracing himself for impact, pulling the girls slightly behind him in a protective gesture. "Mom," Mia cried, finally seeing her. Her face lit up, which made the scene even more surreal. "Mom, look, we got one!" The sentence, which should have been an explanation, sounded like a confession to Sarah. Confirmation that something terrible had happened. She didn't slow down. Her only goal was to snatch her daughters from the man's clutches. The confrontation took place in the middle of the busy sidewalk, pedestrians turning away from the unfolding drama. Sarah reached them, breathless, and her eyes burning with unshed tears and anger. Her first action was to crouch down and pull Mia and Chloe to her, wrapping them in a desperate, almost crushing hug. She buried her face in their hair, inhaling their scent, confirming that they were real, that they were unharmed. The girls, confused by their mother's reaction, hugged her back, but looked over their shoulders at Ethan with worried expressions, as if afraid that their new employee would be frightened. After a long second, Sarah stood up, placing herself between her daughters and Ethan, a lioness protecting her cubs. "Who are you?" she hissed, her voice low and shaking with fury. "What are you doing to my daughters?" Ethan held up his open hands, the universal gesture of not wanting trouble. He was used to hostile negotiations, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer intensity of a mother's protective fury. Any explanation he tried to give would sound insane at best. "Please calm down," he said, his voice as soft and soothing as possible. "They're fine. I was just bringing them back to you." "Bringing them back? From where?" Sarah snapped, her eyes taking in his expensive suit, his watch, his appearance of someone who didn't belong in this neighborhood, this world. His appearance of wealth only increased her distrust. He was a dangerous anomaly. "Mom, no," Mia said, tugging on her mother's coat sleeve. "He's our new father. We hired him for today." Mia's statement landed in the tense air like an anvil. Sarah looked from her daughter to the stranger's face and then back again, her anger flickering, giving way to stunned confusion. "They hired him," she repeated, the word sounding absurd. It was then that her eyes, now less clouded by fury, truly focused on the man in front of her. He didn't look threatening. He looked embarrassed, nervous. There was something about his face, the way his eyes met hers, with an expression of sincere apology that made her hesitate. And beneath the confusion, another feeling began to emerge, a faint, disturbing spark of familiarity. It was a fleeting sensation, like the melody of a long-forgotten song, and she pushed it away, focusing on the impossible reality of the present moment. Seeing the slight opening, Ethan seized the opportunity. He held out his hand, not to her, but to show her the small canvas bag Mia had given him, which he still held in his hand. "They approached me on the street," he explained, his voice still low and careful. "They said they needed a father for the school dance, just for today. This was their payment." He opened the bag, revealing the handful of coins and dollar bills. The sight of this payment, the tangible proof of his daughter's desperate, childish logic, was what finally broke Sarah's dam. Anger, fear, and confusion gave way to an overwhelming wave of mortification and exhaustion. Her legs gave way, and she leaned against the brick wall of a building, closing her eyes for a moment. Her daughters had tried to hire a father. The reality was somehow more painful and humiliating than her worst fear. A heavy silence fell between the three makeshift adults and the two expectant children, who looked from one face to the other, trying to make sense of the drama. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at Ethan, but this time the look in her eyes was different. It was the look of an exhausted, overwhelmed mother looking at a stranger who had been caught in the middle of her private whirlwind. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't know what went through their minds. They wanted someone there today so badly." The confession was an act of vulnerability that completely disarmed Ethan. He saw past the protective lioness and glimpsed the woman beneath, struggling to keep everything afloat. His empathy for the girls instantly expanded to include her as well. "You don't have to apologize," Ethan said softly. "I understand. It was the bravest business proposal I've ever received." He glanced at the girls, who were now clinging to their mother's legs, and winked at them, a small gesture that re-established their secret alliance. The tension on the street began to dissipate, replaced by a deep, palpable awkwardness. They were three strangers bound by a childish request, unsure of what to do next. The logical option was for Ethan to leave, to go back to his life, and for Sarah to take the girls home, perhaps even skip the presentation. But logic had already been ruled out this morning. The girls were looking at their mother with a silent plea in their eyes. The presentation was about to begin. And the father they had met was still there, looking surprisingly willing to fulfill his contract. Sarah was stuck in an impossible bind. Her brain screamed at her to thank the stranger and send him away, to protect her little world from further complications. But her heart could see the disappointment forming on her daughters' faces. They had been so bold, had risked so much, and all for a moment of normality. To deny them that now, after everything, seemed unnecessary cruelty. She looked at Ethan one last time, assessing him. He had had every opportunity to walk away, to laugh at the situation, to dismiss her as a neglectful mother. But he hadn't. He stayed. He stood up for them. He understood. And against all better judgment, a decision began to form in her weary mind. "School is 2 streets away," Sarah said, the words coming out almost on their own, as if spoken by someone else. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact, hanging in the air for him to catch if he wanted. Ethan understood immediately what she wasn't saying. She wasn't going to ask him to go, but she wasn't going to stop him if he did. It was her way of giving him a way out, while leaving the door ajar. He glanced at Mia and Chloe, whose eyes widened with renewed hope. He had cancelled his day, had faced a mother's wrath, and had survived. His curiosity about how this story would end now outweighed any desire to return to his normal life. "Well," he said with a slight smile, "then we'd better not be late. A father should never be late for his first day of work." His answer sealed the deal. Visible relief coursed through Mia and Chloe's small bodies. They pulled away from their mother's legs and, with a naturalness that was both heartbreaking and alarming, each took one of Ethan's hands again. Sarah watched the scene, her heart a confused mix of gratitude and dread. She began to walk, and Ethan fell into step beside her, the girls swinging their arms between them. They made the strangest, most unlikely picture. A suspicious mother, a displaced businessman, and two radiant little girls on their way to pretending to be a family. The silence between the two adults was thick with unasked questions and an underlying tension that neither of them could quite put their finger on. It was more than just the awkwardness of the situation. It was an undercurrent, a sense that their timelines, which should have continued in parallel, had just collided in a way that was both random and inevitable. They reached the gates of the primary school, decorated with colorful balloons and handmade signs. The sound of music and children's laughter drifted through the air from the courtyard. Other families were entering, fathers holding cameras, mothers straightening clothes, children tugging at their hands in a frenzy of excitement. A world of normality that Sarah had always observed from a distance. Today, she was about to enter that world. But her family was a fragile construct, built on childish hope and the kindness of a stranger. As they walked through the gates, side by side, Ethan felt a sinking feeling in his stomach that had nothing to do with business. Sarah felt a chill, despite the warmth of the morning sun. The girls, however, felt nothing but triumph. For them, the plan had worked perfectly. They stepped into the schoolyard, a fake family taking their first tentative steps, with no idea that they were walking towards a truth that was far stranger and more powerful than any lie they could have invented. The schoolyard was a kaleidoscope of chaos and joy. The air was alive with the sound of dozens of conversations, children's laughter, and upbeat pop music blaring from speakers. The smell of popcorn and hot dogs mingled with the smell of grass and hanging artwork. For Ethan, accustomed to the controlled silence of the office, the environment was a sensory assault. He felt like an imposter, a man in a grey suit in a sea of denim and colourful t-shirts. Every smile exchanged between parents, every spontaneous hug, seemed to underscore his phoniness. He gripped the girl's hands a little tighter, his only anchors in the overwhelming, unfamiliar reality he had agreed to inhabit for one day. Sarah felt a different kind of dislocation. For years, she had navigated these events alone, an island of single motherhood. She had developed a coping mechanism, a polite smile, and an ability to keep herself busy. But today, Ethan's presence at her side changed everything. Suddenly, she wasn't invisible. Instead, she felt like she was in a spotlight. She saw the other parents, the mothers she exchanged greetings with, looking at them with a mixture of shock and intrigue. Who was this handsome man standing next to struggling single mother Sarah Miller? The irony was painful. On the day she finally seemed complete in the eyes of the world, she felt more like a fraud than ever, a walking lie. "There, our drawings!" Mia cried, tugging on Ethan's hand with surprising strength. She dragged him toward a large canvas covered in sheets of paper. Ethan let himself be led, feeling Sarah's gaze following him. He found Mia's drawing, a sun with a giant smile, and Chloe's, a field of colorful flowers. He felt their expectant eyes on him, awaiting his verdict. "Dad, do you like it?" Chloe asked, her voice an anxious whisper. The word "dad," spoken in public, directed at him, sounded strange in his ears, but it also triggered a reaction he hadn't expected. The words simply came out, imbued with a sincerity that surprised him. "Like it? I love it. This is the happiest sun I've ever seen, and these flowers are absolutely beautiful." Sarah watched the scene, her heart pounding. She had seen the initial panic in his eyes, and she had seen the way he had overcome it, finding the perfect words. There was a tenderness in his voice that didn't seem fake. He wasn't just playing a role, he was living it with a genuineness that frightened her. And the familiarity came back to bite her, stronger. It wasn't just his face, it was his voice, the cadence of his words. It was a stubborn memory on the fringes of her consciousness, struggling to come to the surface. The teacher's voice over the microphone announced that the girls' class performance was about to begin. They joined the crowd in front of a small stage, sitting on a wooden bench, a socially close and personally uncomfortable distance apart. The children took the stage. Mia and Chloe, standing side by side, scanned the audience with their eyes. When they found Ethan and Sarah, their faces lit up and they waved enthusiastically. Ethan, remembering his instruction, raised both arms above his head and waved back, a wide smile on his face. It was a big gesture, a little awkward, and completely out of character for him. Beside him, Sarah watched the gesture and felt something break inside her. It was a sharp, unexpected pain. Watching Ethan fulfill his daughter's secret wish so easily was like watching a ghost take shape. The children began to sing, and in the relative silence of the audience, Sarah turned to him. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, her voice so low that he had to lean in. Ethan thought for a moment, searching for an honest answer. "I don't know for sure," he admitted. "When they approached me, there was something about the seriousness of them. It felt, important." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I guess in my life, I've been used to complex problems with logical solutions. And then this incredibly simple problem appeared with a solution that was completely illogical, but it felt right. And it was then, as she watched him talk, that the puzzle fell into place. It wasn't his entire face, but one specific detail, the way his left eyebrow arched slightly when he was sincere. It was a tiny tick, but it struck Sarah like a flash of lightning. The image flashed through her mind, no longer hazy, but clear and shocking. A snowy night, almost 8 years ago, a dimly lit bar in River North, a conversation with a young man who was celebrating the sale of his first company. A brief, anonymous, ill-advised encounter driven by loneliness and a sense of invisibility in the big city. A night she had actively tried to forget. Her blood ran cold, her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. It was an impossible coincidence, a cosmic joke of unimaginable cruelty. She looked at him, but now she didn't just see Ethan Hayes, the businessman. She saw the ghost of a young man in his early 20s with the same ambition in his eyes, but with less hardness around them. "You," she began, her voice a whisper, "you lived in Chicago for about 8 years. The question was so specific that Ethan looked at her in surprise. "Yes, I started my first company here back then. Why?" He said it casually. But to Sarah, each word was a nail in the coffin. 8 years. The math was simple, brutal, and perfect. Her daughters were 7.5. A wave of nausea swept through her. She looked at her daughters, who were now running toward them, and for the first time she saw it. It was in the shape of Chloe's jaw, an exact replica of his. It was in the stubborn gleam in Mia's eyes, the same gleam he had now. The man her daughters had randomly picked out on the street was no stranger. He was their father, their biological father. "Sarah, are you okay? You've gone pale." Ethan's concerned voice cut through her haze of shock. She looked at him, at the man who, moments before, had picked up one of her daughters, completely oblivious to the fact that he was holding his own flesh and blood. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? How could one voice such a monumental truth in the middle of a schoolyard? Her deepest secret had just exploded in her face, brought to her by the hand of pure, innocent chance. Or maybe, she thought, looking at the happy faces of her daughters, it hadn't been chance at all, but instinct. A recognition that existed beyond memory. She needed air. She needed to escape this revelation that was too big for the cramped confines of her skull. I need a minute," she managed. She stepped back, away from him and the girls, her gaze darting between his face and theirs, finding 1,000 tiny similarities that had been hidden in plain sight for 7 years. How had she never seen them? Maybe because she had refused to look. A new determination, cold and frightening, began to take hold of her panic. She was not a victim. She was the keeper of her daughter's story, and that story had just gotten a lot more complicated. She had to tell him. With this new, heavy determination, Sarah straightened her back. She walked back toward him, her expression so changed that Ethan knew the game was up. "We have to leave," she said, her voice firm. The girls protested, but Ethan saw the look in Sarah's eyes and knew something real was happening. He nodded immediately, helping to convince the disappointed girls. The exit was a blur of tense movements. As they passed through the gates, leaving behind the balloons and the music, it was as if they had stepped through a membrane into another dimension. The silence between them was heavy, heavy with unasked questions. Sarah led them not to her apartment but to a small park nearby, an oasis of green nestled between the buildings. She stopped at a secluded wooden bench beneath the shade of an ancient plane tree. The girls scurried to a nearby swing, leaving the 2 adults alone. Ethan looked at her, his patience finally giving way to a need for answers. "Sarah," he began softly, "what's wrong? You're scaring me." Sarah turned to him, her body shaking with the force of the truth she carried. "What I'm about to tell you will seem impossible," she began, her voice surprisingly steady. "This morning, my daughters went out to find a father. They chose you, a stranger. But it wasn't by chance, Ethan. It wasn't a coincidence." The confusion on Ethan's face was total. "What do you mean? We've never met before." Her statement was a statement, but it sounded almost like a question, his own mind doubting his memory in the face of her conviction. "We've met before," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "Almost 8 years ago, in a bar in River North. There was a snowstorm. You were celebrating the sale of your first company." Every detail was a hammer blow, shattering his denial. The memory, hazy and clouded by time and champagne, began to focus with terrifying clarity. The celebration, the snow falling outside, a beautiful, sad woman he'd shared a conversation with, and more. He opened his mouth to speak, but he couldn't form words. His mind, usually so quick, was frozen. Sophia didn't need his confirmation. She took the final step, the coup de grace that would bring his world crashing down just as hers had. She looked from his dazed eyes to the 2 girls laughing on the swings, and then back to him. "My daughters didn't choose you by chance, Ethan," she said, her voice now a whisper, heavy with the weight of 8 years of secrets. "They chose you because they recognized you. They didn't need a surrogate father. They found their real one." Sarah's words hung in the still air of the park, not as a sound, but as a physical force that hit Ethan like a shockwave. They found the real one. The words echoed in the silence of his mind, shattering all the logical structures that governed his existence. He looked at Mia and Chloe on the swings, and saw them as if for the first time. He saw the curve of his own nose in the face of one, the shape of his own mother's eyes in the face of the other. They were mirrors of his past, of his blood. His empire of numbers and projections crumbled to dust, revealing itself to be an empty construct. He hadn't gained 2 daughters that day. He had realized the overwhelming magnitude of what he had lost. 7.5 years of a life he hadn't even known was his. A long, deep silence stretched between them. Sarah watched him, braced for any reaction. Denial, anger, accusation, but the storm never came. The shock on Ethan's face slowly dissolved, not into fury but into a look of deep, stunned pain. He didn't see a woman who had kept a secret from him. He saw a woman who had carried an impossible burden alone. He saw her 2 jobs, the exhaustion etched on her face, the strength with which she had protected them. His first reaction was not self-pity, but overwhelming empathy. He took a step toward her. "You," he said, his voice hoarse and broken, "you did all this alone." In that single sentence, he didn't offer an apology. He offered recognition. The girls, sensing the change in the atmosphere, stopped rocking and cautiously approached. "Mum, is everything okay?" Mia asked, her small voice breaking the spell. The simple question made Ethan's theoretical reality become a physical, overwhelming presence. He looked at them, his daughters, and without thinking he knelt on the grass, his expensive suit forgotten. He was no longer a businessman or an actor. He was a father seeing his children for the first time. There were no words for that moment, so he simply opened his arms. Mia and Chloe, who had felt an inexplicable connection to this man all day, didn't hesitate. They ran into his embrace as if they were coming home. Ethan wrapped his arms around them, feeling their small bodies against his chest, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt both utterly undone and entirely complete. Sarah, watching them, felt the tears she had been holding back all day finally fall, a silent river of pain and relief and an uncertain, frightening future. Their embrace lasted a long moment, a first act of a family being born right there in a public park, from the ruins of a secret and the strength of a childish plea. When they parted, the awkwardness had not disappeared, but there was something else in its place, a fragile but real foundation on which they could begin to build. They ended up sitting on the park bench, the four of them, a newly formed and unstable constellation. The girls, sensing that something fundamental had changed for the better, snuggled against Ethan on either side with a naturalness that was breathtaking. He turned to Sarah with an arm around each of them. His face was that of a man who had aged a decade in an hour. He did not ask about the past. His questions were small and present and urgent, the questions of a man desperately trying to make up for lost time. "What's her favorite bedtime story?" he whispered. "Is she still afraid of the dark?" And Sarah, her voice soft, began to share the small, sacred secrets of their lives, weaving a father into the tapestry of a life that had, until now, only had the threads of a mother. In the soft light of a late Chicago afternoon, the scene on the park bench was a silent testament to the day's transformation. A man who had begun the morning as a solitary king in his glass castle now sat huddled between two tiny queens, feeling richer than any of his business dealings could have made him feel. A woman who had begun the day drowning in the exhaustion of single motherhood felt for the first time the outline of another hand helping to hold the weight of her world. And two little girls who had woken up with a father-shaped hole on their special day were ending it at the very center of their universe. Their innocent search for a surrogate father had led them not to a convenient lie, but to the deepest, most complicated truth of all. This moment was not a happy ending, but something much more real and precious, the messy, frightening, and incredibly beautiful beginning of their true family story. They weren't looking for a real father, they just wanted a fantasy day and ended up finding an entire family, healing a past they didn't even know existed. Sometimes life seems to throw us a curveball, twisting our paths in ways we can't understand. But it's precisely in these unexpected twists and turns that we discover what truly guides us. The strength of a child's hope, the courage to face the truth when it knocks on our door, and the ability to build a home not just through blood, but through the daily choice to love and stay. If this story touched your heart, just as it forever changed the lives of Sarah, Ethan, Mia, and Chloe, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that remind us of what really matters, recognizing our family with our hearts.